The padlock on Unit 412 didn't yield to the key. It had to be taken off with a pair of long-handled bolt cutters that smelled of WD-40 and cold grease. When the rusted steel finally snapped, the sound was flat and heavy, swallowed instantly by the damp salt fog rolling off the Portsmouth harbor. Carter Miller didn't flinch. At 48, loud, sudden noises still made his jaw tighten, but he had learned to mask the reaction behind a slow, deliberate exhale. He wiped a streak of rusty condensation from his forehead with the back of his sleeve and looked down at his left side. Standing perfectly parallel to his boot was Duke. The German Shepherd was 9 years old, with a coat the color of wet river rock and coal. His left ear carried a clean, V-shaped notch from a piece of stray metal in the Persian Gulf, and his muzzle was heavily frosted with gray, making him look less like a pet and more like an old chief petty officer who had spent 30 years drinking black coffee and staring at bulkheads. Duke didn't look at the locker. His dark amber eyes were fixed on the gravel alleyway behind them, scanning the gray space between the rows of corrugated metal buildings. "Well, partner," Carter muttered, his voice gravelly from years of salt air and too many night watches. "This is the Grand Estate. Don't go spending your inheritance all in one place." Duke let out a brief, dry huff through his nose, his version of a sigh, and shifted his weight, favoring his right hind leg just slightly. It was a cold-weather limp, a memento from the same deployment that had left Carter with a titanium rod in his left femur and a medical discharge paper that felt more like an eviction notice from the only life he had ever understood. The storage facility was called Harbor Road Self-Storage, though storage was a generous term for a collection of leaking tin boxes built on a salt marsh behind a defunct fish packing plant. The manager, a squint-eyed man named Skaggs, who wore a grease-stained orange hunting vest despite the lack of woods for miles, stood 3 paces back, holding a clipboard like a shield. "I'm telling you, Miller, you're paying $5 for 500 pounds of wet rot," Skaggs said, spitting a dark stream of tobacco juice onto the gravel. "The unit belonged to Old Man Vance. He died 3 months back in the county home. Nobody came for his stuff because nobody wanted to pay the back rent. The county health inspector put an orange sticker on it because of the standing water inside. Biohazard, he called it. Personally, I think he just didn't want to carry the boxes out. But law says I gotta auction it. You're the only one who showed up. $5 and it's yours, but you got 48 hours to clear it, or I charge you $50 a day for disposal." "I heard you the first 3 times, Skaggs," Carter said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill, the last physical currency he possessed. After paying the weekly rate on the rusty Dodge Ram parked near the gate, he handed it over. Skaggs took the bill, squinted at it, as if checking for counterfeit markers, and shook his head. "You veterans, always buying someone else's junk thinking you're gonna find a gold watch. There ain't nothing in there but mold, Carter. Good luck with the smell." The manager shuffled off toward his office, his boots crunching rhythmically on the wet gravel until the fog swallowed his shape. Carter turned back to the locker. The orange warning sticker on the door had peeled at the corners, weeping, sticky, adhesive down the blue paint. He reached for the handle, hesitated, and glanced at Duke. "Sent check, boy," Carter said quietly. He stepped forward, his broad chest clearing the threshold first. His nose worked rapidly. His nostrils flared as he took in the heavy, stagnant draft from the dark interior. A normal dog might have recoiled from the stench of rotten canvas, battery acid, and old marsh water, but Duke had been trained to find explosives in 90-degree heat next to open sewers. He went cold and professional, his ears rotating forward like radar dishes. After 5 seconds of deep sniffing, Duke looked back at Carter, his tail giving a single low wag. No alert, no immediate danger, just old trash. Carter lifted the door. It screeched in its tracks. releasing a thick, humid cloud that smelled exactly like the bilge of a decommissioned cargo ship. The locker was 10 feet deep and 5 feet wide. The back half was completely dark, but the front was illuminated by the dull gray light of the harbor morning. Carter's $5 empire consisted of 3 stacked rows of waterlogged cardboard boxes that had collapsed under their own weight, forming a mushy hill of gray pulp. A stack of bald tires sat in the corner, their wells filled with greasy water that had bred a thick skim of black algae. Next to them lay several rusted boat anchors, a pile of dry-rotted nylon mooring lines, and several green plastic milk crates filled with what looked like engine gaskets and corroded brass screws. "Magnificent," Carter said, stepping inside. The concrete floor was slick, with a thin layer of mud. "We've got enough copper scrap here to buy us a couple of cans of soup, Duke. Maybe some of those dog biscuits that don't taste like cardboard if we're lucky." Duke entered the locker with quiet, deliberate steps, keeping his belly high to avoid the puddles. He ignored the boxes of wet paper. He ignored the tires. Instead, he walked straight toward the dark back corner of the unit, where the ceiling sagged slightly and a steady drip of cold water was hitting something hard and metallic. Carter reached into his pocket for his flashlight. It was an old, heavy-duty military-issue maglite. The black anodizing worn down to the bright aluminum at the grip. He clicked it on, the yellow beam cutting through the damp gloom. Duke was standing over a long, rectangular shape, half hidden beneath a moldy canvas tarp. The dog's head was down, his nose pressed against the edge of the canvas. He was breathing heavily, his tail rigid. "What is it, Duke?" "Dead rat." Carter walked over, the wet mud sucking at the soles of his boots. He reached down and yanked the canvas tarp away. Beneath it sat an old naval sea chest. It was constructed of heavy, oil-darkened oak, bound with thick bands of zinc-plated steel that had gone white and chalky with corrosion. The chest was roughly 4 feet long and 2 feet deep, built like a small bunker. The name Vance, GUSN, was stenciled across the lid in faded yellow block letters, alongside a service number that predated the zip code system. The chest had 2 heavy padlock clasps, but neither was locked. They were held in place by 2 rusted brass cotter pins. "Well," Carter muttered, crouching down next to Duke. His knee gave a loud, dry pop that echoed off the metal walls. "Looks like Old Man Vance was a black shoe sailor. Let's see what he didn't want the state hospital to find." He pulled the first cotter pin. It snapped in his fingers, the metal degraded by decades of salt air. He pulled the second one, which came out in a shower of dry rust. He placed his hands under the heavy oak lid and lifted the hinges, screamed, a dry, metallic screech that sounded like a wounded gull. The interior of the chest was dry. Unlike the cardboard boxes outside, the oak lid had been sealed with a thick gasket of greased leather that had managed to keep the moisture out for 40 years. The smell that rose from the chest wasn't rot. It was the clean, sharp scent of pine tar, camphor, and high-grade machine oil. On the top tray of the chest sat several neat piles of military uniforms, a pair of wool dress blues with the gold hash marks of a chief petty officer, 3 sets of faded dungarees, and a heavy peacoat with tarnished anchor buttons. Resting on the peacoat was a leather-bound logbook, its cover scarred by water rings. Carter picked up the logbook. The paper was thick and yellowed, the entries written in a tight, mechanical hand using black fountain pen ink. The 14th of October, 1967. USS Lawrence. Sea State 4, fuel consumption normal. Port engine turbine housing showing slight vibration at 180 revolutions per minute. Adjusted packing. It was the daily journal of an old-school machinist's mate. No grand secrets, no personal thoughts, just steam pressures, oil levels, and the names of junior sailors who had failed their inspection. "Just a work log, Duke. Carter said, setting it aside. He reached into the chest and lifted the top wooden tray. It was surprisingly heavy, built of solid cedar. Beneath the tray lay the bulk of Vance's personal life. There was a small velvet-lined box containing a Good Conduct Medal, a National Defense Service medal, and a bronze star with a Combat V device. Next to it sat a stack of letters tied with a piece of tarred marline, their envelopes carrying postmarks from San Diego, Subic Bay, and Yokosuka. But Duke wasn't interested in the medals or the letters. The dog's ears were flat against his head, his tail vibrating with an intensity Carter hadn't seen since they were scanning dirt roads in Al-Anbar province. Duke's nose was jammed into the rear left corner of the chest's bottom compartment, right where the cedar lining met the heavy oak frame. He let out a low, frustrated whine, then began to scratch at the corner with his right paw, his nails clicking sharply against the wood. "Hey, easy," Carter said, placing a hand on the dog's shoulder. "No digging. You'll ruin the wood." Duke stopped, but he didn't look up. He looked at the wood, then at Carter, then back at the wood. He gave a sharp, high-pitched boof through his teeth, his specific signal for there is something hidden here, and you are being slow. Carter frowned. He took the flashlight and shone the beam directly into the corner where Duke was pointing. To the naked eye, the bottom of the chest looked solid. It was made of 3 thick planks of cedar, darkened by time. But when Carter pressed his fingers into the corner, he felt a slight give. The wood didn't creak. It shifted with a greasy, mechanical smoothness. "Hold on," Carter murmured. He cleared out the rest of the chest. The letters, the uniforms, a small collection of brass belt buckles, and 3 old sailors' knives, until the bare cedar bottom was exposed. In the center of the middle plank was a small round indentation, about the size of a nickel. It looked like a knot in the wood. But when Carter shone the light directly into it, he saw it wasn't a knot at all. It was a brass plug, flush with the surface. He took his pocket knife, a simple, flat-handled military utility knife, and used the screwdriver attachment to turn the brass plug. It resisted at first, but with a hard twist, it clicked and turned 90 degrees. With a soft, hollow thump, the entire rear cedar plank rose about half an inch. Duke let out a short bark and took 2 steps back, his tail wagging furiously. "Good boy," Carter whispered, his heart starting to thump against his ribs. "You still got the touch." Carter wedged the blade of his knife under the raised plank and lifted. The cedar board was actually a false bottom, constructed of 3 thin layers of wood laminated together to resist warping. Beneath it lay a shallow compartment, 6 inches deep, lined with green baize that had faded to the color of dry moss. The compartment wasn't filled with gold bars or jewels. Instead, resting in the center of the green felt were 3 objects. First, a heavy cylindrical zinc tube with a threaded cap, the kind used by the Navy to protect sensitive blueprints from water damage during battle. Second, a thick, oiled canvas bundle wrapped tightly in heavy-duty electrician's tape. Third, a small black painted iron cash box with a heavy brass handle on top. Before Carter could reach for the zinc tube, a shadow fell over the opening of the storage locker. Duke spun instantly. His hackles went up like a ridge of stiff pine needles, his lips curling back to reveal his yellowed teeth in a silent, terrifying snarl. He didn't bark. A trained working dog didn't waste breath on noise when a threat was close. He simply lowered his center of gravity and waited. Carter reached down, his fingers automatically closing around the heavy handle of the maglite. He stood up slowly, his bad leg aching from the cold, and stepped toward the light. Standing in the doorway of the locker was Skaggs. He wasn't alone. Beside him was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a leather jacket that smelled of stale tobacco and cheap cologne. The man had a flat, broken nose and short-cropped gray hair that suggested he had spent time in a brig or a state penitentiary. He had his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his eyes scanning the interior of the unit with a predatory, calculating intensity. "Find anything good, Carter?" Skaggs asked. His voice was different now, faster, higher. He didn't spit his tobacco. "We was just thinking. Maybe I made a mistake on that paperwork. Technically, the state probate court hasn't cleared the estate. I might have auctioned this unit before the legal hold was off." The tall man stepped into the locker. He didn't look at Carter. He looked at the open sea chest, his eyes locking onto the false bottom and the zinc tube visible in the flashlight beam. "That's his chest," the man said. His voice was low and wet, like gravel being turned over by a shovel. "The old man's chest," Skaggs said. "You found it." Duke took one step forward. A low, vibrating rumble started in his chest, a sound so deep Carter could feel it through the soles of his boots. It was the sound that had stopped 3 different suicide bombers in their tracks before they could pull the lanyard. The tall man stopped. He looked at Duke, his eyes narrowing. "You need to put that dog on a chain, mister. I don't like dogs. Duke doesn't like people who walk into my locker without asking," Carter said. His voice was flat, carrying the cold authority of a man who had commanded 40-man division decks. "The auction is over, Skaggs. I paid the $5. You signed the receipt. The contents of this unit are my property." "Now, let's not get hasty," Skaggs said, taking a half step back into the fog. "This here is Silas Vance. He's the old man's nephew. He's got legal rights, family rights." "The old man died in the county home 3 months ago," Carter said, keeping his eyes on Silas. "You told me nobody came for his stuff because nobody wanted to pay the rent." "Where was the family then, Silas?" Silas didn't answer. He took his right hand out of his pocket. In his palm was a heavy rusted iron pry bar he must have picked up from the scrap pile outside. "I ain't asking you for the junk, Navy," Silas said. "I'm taking the chest. My uncle had some personal papers, family stuff. You give me the chest, and I'll give you your $5 back. Heck, I'll give you 20. You can buy yourself a nice bottle of gin and forget you ever saw this place." Carter looked at the pry bar. Then he looked at Duke. "Duke," Carter said quietly. "Watch." The German shepherd shifted. He didn't lung, simply moved into the gap between Silas and the chest, his eyes fixed on Silas's throat. The dog's body was perfectly still, but the muscles in his hindquarters were bunched like steel springs. "You think you're the first guy with a piece of iron who thought he could take something from me, Silas?" Carter asked, his voice steady. "I've had 12.7mm rounds taking the paint off my bulkhead while I was trying to fix a pump. Your little tire iron doesn't register on my scale. You take one more step into this locker, and my dog is going to take 3 inches of meat out of your forearm." And since Skaggs here signed the health hazard waiver on this unit, the police are going to have a real hard time explaining why you were in here trying to rob a disabled veteran. Silas stared at the dog. He was a big man, used to intimidating people in the harbor bars. But he wasn't stupid. He could see the scar tissue on Duke's ears. He could see the professional, cold lack of fear in the dog's eyes. This wasn't a pet that would run if you kicked it. This was a weapon with teeth. "You're making a mistake, Miller," Silas spat, though he took a slow step backward. "That chest is cursed. My uncle spent 40 years hiding what was in there. It didn't do him no good. He died alone on a cot in a room that smelled like floor wax. It won't do you no good either." "I'll take my chances," Carter said. "Now get out of my unit before I decide to let Duke do his job." Silas glared at him for 3 long seconds, then turned and walked out into the fog. Skaggs looked at Carter, his face pale under his orange vest. 48 hours, Miller," Skaggs muttered, his voice trembling. "Then I'm calling the county sheriff." He hurried after Silas, his boots splashing through the mud. Carter waited until the sound of their footsteps had completely faded. He let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Good boy, Duke," he whispered, reaching down to scratch the dog behind his good ear. Stand down. Duke relaxed instantly, his tongue lolling out the side of his mouth as he let out a doggy grin. He licked Carter's hand once, then turned back to the chest, as if to say, "Now where were we?" Carter crouched back down. And he took the 3 items from the false bottom, the zinc tube, the canvas bundle, and the black iron box, and placed them carefully into his military backpack. He didn't want to open them here, not with Silas and Skaggs watching from the office. He closed the heavy oak lid of the sea chest, snapped the clasps shut, and took a heavy nylon mooring line from the pile, and he tied the chest with a series of tight, professional half-hitches, forming a makeshift carrying harness. "All right, partner," Carter said, hoisting the heavy pack onto his shoulders and taking the rope handle of the chest in his right hand. "Let's go home, or what's left of it." The home was the Dodge Ram. Carter had built a small wooden sleeping platform in the bed, covered by a heavy fiberglass topper. It was cold, it was cramped, and it smelled of Duke's dry food and Carter's old wool blankets. But it was dry, and nobody asked him for rent on the 1st of the month. He drove 3 miles down the coastal road to a small gravel turnout overlooking the salt marshes of the Piscataqua River. The tide was coming in, the gray water pushing through the yellow salt grass under a sky that had turned the color of lead. Carter killed the engine, turned on the truck's battery-operated cab light, and climbed into the back with Duke. The dog curled up on his wool blanket, his head resting on Carter's knee, his amber eyes watching the backpack. "Let's see what we got," Carter said. He pulled the zinc tube out first. The brass cap was sealed with a thick ring of beeswax. He used his pocket knife to scrape the wax away, then twisted the cap. It gave with a dry pop, releasing a puff of air that smelled of ancient paper and vinegar. Inside was a single roll of heavy linen-backed paper. Carter pulled it out carefully and unrolled it across the sleeping platform, using his flashlight and his knife to hold the corners down. It wasn't a blueprint, it was a map. But it was a map unlike any Carter had seen during his time in the Navy. It was a detailed, hand-drawn chart of the Piscataqua River Basin, dated 1969. The drawing was incredibly precise, showing depth soundings, ledge formations, and old wharf pilings that had long since rotted away. Several areas of the river were marked with small, red ink numbers, and along the margin was a column of corresponding coordinates and short, cryptic notes written in Vance's tight hand. Red 1, Old Coal Wharf, 1, 4 feet at low water. Mud bottom safe. Red 2, Spinney Creek Ledge. Obstruction removed, 68. Gravel. Red 3, Badger's Island Cove. Secret holding, 22 feet. Secure. "A navigation chart," Carter muttered, his finger tracing the red lines. "But why hide it under a false bottom? You don't hide a map of the local river. Unless you're moving something you don't want the Coast Guard to see." He set the map aside and reached for the second item. The oiled canvas bundle wrapped in black tape. He sliced through the tape with his knife, peeling back the layers of sticky plastic and greasy cloth. Inside was a thick, leather-bound notebook with the words, "Operation CLIGHT. Lag," written across the cover in faded gold leaf. Carter opened the first page. The 12th of July, 1968. This record is kept by Chief Machinist's Mate, E.G.S. Vance, USN, under terms of the National Security Act of 1947. Contents are classified, confidential until retired. Carter's breath caught in his throat. He knew about Sealight. Every old sailor in the Portsmouth yard had heard the rumors. In the late 60s, during the height of the Cold War, the Navy had run a series of classified tests in the deep channels of the Piscataqua River. They were testing experimental midget submarines, prototype spy vessels designed to be launched from larger fleet boats to tap Soviet undersea cables. But the official story was that the project had been canceled. After the prototype, the XS-1, sank during a night test in November 1968, taking 2 civilian engineers down with her. The Navy had claimed the vessel was recovered and scrapped. Carter began to read Vance's log. The 8th of November, 1968, XS-1 lost during Run 3. Port shaft seal failed. Command ordered immediate evacuation of testing area. No recovery attempted due to risk of Soviet surveillance. Vessel was scuttled in designated deep hole off Badger's Island. Carter stared at the page. "They didn't recover it," he whispered to Duke. "The official record is a lie. They left her down there." He turned the page. The 10th of November, 1968. Command has declared project defunct. All records ordered burned. I cannot comply. The design of the silver zinc battery pack on the XS-1 contains 40 pounds of high-purity industrial silver and 10 ounces of platinum catalyst in the fuel cell. If salvaged, the metals alone are worth a fortune. More importantly, the logs of the vessel's performance must be preserved to clear the names of the engineers. They didn't make a mistake. The command ordered the test, despite my warning about the shaft seal. Duke gave a low whine, his nose nudging Carter's hand, as if sensing the sudden tension in his owner's body. "He hid the coordinates of the wreck, Duke," Carter said, his voice barely a whisper. "He scuttled the sub, then spent the next 40 years keeping the secret. He didn't salvage the silver because he knew the Navy would be watching him. He was waiting for the project to be forgotten. He was waiting for the world to move on." Carter picked up the third item, the black iron cash box. The lock was a simple 3-tumbler combination. Carter looked at the logbook. On the inside cover, written in very small numbers, was a date, 11/08/68. He turned the tumblers on the box, 11/08/68. With a sharp click, the latch popped open. Carter lifted the lid. Inside the box were 2 neat stacks of old paper currency. They weren't greenbacks. They were military payment certificates, MP, used by soldiers and sailors overseas during the Vietnam War, along with 40 bright, heavy silver dollars dated between 1880 and 1921. But beneath the money was the real treasure. It was a small, sealed plastic pouch containing several folded sheets of official parchment. Carter opened them carefully. They were land deeds. End quote. Specifically, they were deeds to 3 small undeveloped parcels of marshy riverfront land along the Piscataqua, purchased by E.G.V. Ansons in the early 1972 using his Navy retirement pay. According to the town registry stamps on the back, the taxes had been paid in advance through a perpetual trust fund Vance had set up before his death. Carter traced the map coordinates of the 3 parcels on the hand-drawn chart. They aligned perfectly with the secret holdings Vance had marked in red. One of those parcels, a 3-acre strip of rocky ledge and salt marsh off Badger's Island, sat directly overlooking the deep channel where the XS-1 had been scuttled. He bought the land to keep people away from the wreck, Carter realized. He was guarding her from the shore. Suddenly, Duke's ears shot upright. The dog scrambled to his feet on the wooden platform, his nose pressed against the glass of the truck topper. He let out a sharp, warning growl. Carter looked through the window. Through the swirling salt fog, he saw the headlights of a vehicle coming slowly down the gravel turnout. The engine was quiet, but Carter recognized the rattling idle of an old Ford diesel. It was Silas Vance's truck. "They followed us," Carter said, his voice tightening. "Skaggs must have had a tracker on the unit, or they just knew where I'd go." He shoved the papers, the map, and the cash box back into his pack and zipped it tight. He grabbed his heavy maglite and climbed down from the truck bed, Duke sliding out behind him. The air was freezing now, the wind whipping off the river, carrying the smell of wet mud and rotting kelp. The diesel truck stopped 30 feet away, its high beams cutting through the fog, blinding Carter. The doors creaked open. Silas Vance stepped out of the driver's side. From the passenger side came Skaggs, holding a heavy double-barreled shotgun he had likely taken from the rack in his office. "You should have taken the $20, Miller," Silas said, walking slowly toward the Dodge. He had his hands free now, his fingers twitching at his sides. "My uncle was a hoarder, but he wasn't stupid. He told my father about the silver before he lost his mind. He said there was 40 pounds of pure bullion hidden on this river, and he had the map. We know you got it in that pack." "The silver isn't in a box, Silas," Carter said, keeping his flashlight pointed at the ground to preserve his night vision. "It's 70 feet down in a scuttled military submarine, and it's federal property. If you touch it, the Navy will put you under the Portsmouth brig before you can dry the mud off your boots." Silas stopped, his eyes widening slightly. "A sub? You're lying." The old man was crazy. "He wasn't crazy," Carter said. "He was a chief. He had honor. Something you and Skaggs wouldn't understand if it was stenciled on your foreheads." "I don't care about no Navy rules," Skaggs said, raising the shotgun. His hands were shaking, the barrels weaving in the gray light. "We want the map, Carter. Just hand over the pack and we'll let you drive out of here. If you don't, well, the tide's coming in." People get swept off these ledges all the time. Carter didn't move. He felt the cold iron of the titanium rod in his leg, a dull ache that reminded him of everything he had lost. He had spent 20 years serving a country that had given him a $5 locker and a truck to sleep in. He was tired of running. He was tired of feeling like he was a ghost in his own life. He looked at Duke. The German shepherd was standing beside him, his body perfectly still, his eyes locked on Skaggs's shotgun. Duke didn't look back at Carter. He didn't need to. They had cleared 50 houses together in Fallujah. They knew the math of a firefight. "You're not going to shoot me, Skaggs," Carter said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. "Because if you do, that shotgun is going to make a sound that every house within 2 miles will hear. And the second your finger touches that trigger, Duke is going to be on you. You might get 1 shot off, but you won't get the second. And my dog doesn't stop until the threat is gone." Skaggs swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his orange vest. "Silas, I don't know about this, the veteran. He's got that look." "Shut up, Skaggs," Silas spat. He took a heavy brass knuckle duster out of his pocket and slipped his fingers through the rings. "The dog's old. Look at him. He's got gray on his face. He's limping." "He might be old, Silas," Carter said, taking a slow step forward. "But he's still a chief, and we don't abandon the watch." Before Silas could react, Carter did something he hadn't done since his last day of active duty. He didn't run. He didn't yell. He clicked his mag light off, plunging the space between them into sudden, absolute darkness. "Duke, attack." In the pitch black, the sound of the German shepherd's launch was like a whip cracking. Duke didn't growl. He spent all his energy on speed. A loud, terrified scream erupted from Skaggs as 80 pounds of muscle and teeth slammed into his chest, sending him crashing into the gravel. The shotgun went off with a deafening bow, the blast lighting up the fog for a fraction of a second, the lead shot tearing harmlessly into the salt grass. Silas lunged forward in the dark, swinging his heavy brass fist toward where he thought Carter was standing. But Carter was already moving. Despite his bad leg, his Navy training took over. He sidestepped the blow, the wind of Silas's fist whistling past his ear, and drove the heavy aluminum end of his maglite straight into Silas's ribs. The metal struck with a dull thump. Silas let out a wet gasp and doubled over. Carter didn't give him a chance to recover. He brought the flashlight down in a hard diagonal strike across the back of Silas's neck. The big man went down like a felled pine, his face burying in the wet gravel. 30 feet away, Skaggs was screaming in the dark, "Get him off me! Get him off me! He's killing me!" Carter clicked the flashlight back on. Duke was standing over Skaggs, his front paws pinned to the manager's shoulders, his jaws locked on the thick canvas of the orange hunting vest, right next to Skaggs's throat. The shotgun was lying 10 feet away in the mud. "Duke," Carter called out, his voice steady. "Hold!" Duke stopped pulling at the vest, but he didn't move his paws. He stared down at Skaggs, his teeth showing, a single drop of hot saliva falling onto the manager's nose. "Don't move, Skaggs," Carter said, walking over and picking up the shotgun. He opened the breech, popped the spent shell and the live one out, and tossed them into the river. "If you move, Duke thinks you're trying to escape, and he hates runners." Skaggs lay perfectly still, his eyes wide, weeping silently into the wet gravel. "Please, Miller, we was just... Silas said there was money. We wasn't gonna hurt you." "Get up," Carter said to Silas, who was groaning in the mud holding his ribs. "Both of you, get in the truck." 10 minutes later, the diesel Ford was driving away down the coastal road, its taillights disappearing into the fog. Silas was driving, his face white, holding his broken ribs with one hand. Skaggs was in the passenger seat, his orange vest torn to ribbons, staring blankly ahead. Carter stood on the gravel turnout, his hand resting on Duke's head. The dog's tail was wagging slowly, his head leaning into Carter's leg. "You okay, boy?" Carter asked. Duke let out a short, happy bark. He was muddy, he was wet, and his limp was going to be terrible tomorrow, but his eyes were bright. For the first time in years, the old dog looked like he had a job again. Carter looked down at his backpack. He had the map, he had the deeds, he had the truth about what had happened on the river 50 years ago. "Well, Chief Vance," Carter said, looking out over the dark water where the XS-1 lay buried in the mud. "Looks like you've been relieved. I'll take the watch from here." The next 6 months in Portsmouth passed with the slow, grinding rhythm of a ship undergoing refit. Carter didn't sell the silver. He didn't go digging for the submarine. Instead, he took the cash from the black iron box, nearly $1,200 in old coins and military currency, and used it to pay the back taxes on the 3 acres of land Vance had left behind on Badger's Island. The land was mostly rocky ledge and salt marsh, but it had an old, cedar-shingled fish house sitting on wooden pilings over the water. The roof leaked, the pilings were green with seaweed, and the dock had collapsed into the mud during the winter storms of '98. But to Carter, it looked like a dry dock. With Skaggs gone, having suddenly decided to retire and move to Florida after his accident on the river, the new manager of the storage facility didn't ask questions about the sea chest. Carter moved his things out of Unit 412 and into the old fish house. He spent his days working with his hands. He replaced the cedar shingles. He jacked up the sagging corner of the floor and replaced the rotted timber with a clean spruce log he dragged out of the woods. He built a small wood stove out of an old steel oil drum. And by November, the fish house was warm, dry, and smelled of cedar smoke and hot tea. Every afternoon, Duke would sit on the rebuilt dock, his gray muzzle facing the river, watching the lobster boats run the channel. He didn't bark at the boats. He didn't bark at the gulls. He just watched, his ears rotating toward the sound of the diesel engines. One Saturday in late November, a silver SUV drove down the narrow gravel road leading to the island. Carter was on the dock, splining an old cedar oar. He stopped his work and stood up, his hand automatically dropping to Duke's head. The car stopped. A young woman with short-cut brown hair and a heavy woolen coat got out. She had a camera hanging around her neck and a thick leather folder under her arm. "Carter Miller?" she asked. Her voice was clear, carrying over the sound of the water. "I am," Carter said. "Can I help you?" "My name is Sarah Vance," she said, walking slowly onto the dock. She didn't look at Carter. She was looking at Duke. "I'm E.G. Vance's granddaughter. The county administrator told me you bought his storage unit at the auction." Carter's hand tightened slightly on Duke's collar. "If you're here with Silas, you can turn the car around right now." Sarah stopped, her face softening. I'm not with Silas. Silas is. Well, the police in Kittery are looking for him for some stolen marine equipment. I haven't talked to him in 5 years. I'm a historian for the Navy Yard. I've been trying to find my grandfather's service records for 10 years, but the Navy kept telling me they were destroyed in the 1973 archive fire in St. Louis. She looked at the old fish house, then at the water. But I knew he had a chest. He told my mother about it before he died. He said he had kept a record of the Sea Light project. He said the men who died, they were careless, they were ordered to go down. Carter stared at her for a long moment. He looked at Duke. The German shepherd had stepped forward, his nose stretching out to sniff the hem of her coat. He didn't growl. His tail gave a single, slow, friendly wag. Duke says you're telling the truth, Carter said. He turned and pointed toward the door of the fish house. Come on inside out of the wind. The tea's just about hot. They sat by the steel drum stove, the dry cedar wood crackling inside. Carter laid the leather-bound logbook and the zinc tube on the wooden table. Sarah touched the logbook with her fingertips, her eyes turning shiny in the yellow lamplight. He kept it, she whispered. All this time he kept the names. He was a machinist's mate, Carter said, pouring 2 cups of black tea into rusted tin mugs. We don't leave the log incomplete. He wanted to make sure the record was straight. What are you going to do with the land, Carter? She asked, looking out the window at the gray river. Silas thought there was silver here. He wanted to dredge the channel. There's no silver here that belongs to me, Carter said. He reached down and rubbed Duke's neck. But your grandfather left something better than silver. He left 3 acres of dry land on a river that doesn't care about your discharge papers or your bad leg. He left a place where a man can sit and watch the tide go out without nobody asking him what he's doing there. Carter stood up and walked to the door, opening it to let the fresh salt air in. I'm building a shop, he said, pointing toward the empty bay of the fish house. A place where the guys from the Portsmouth Hospital can come and work on boats, old dories, skiffs, whatever needs a new rib or a coat of paint. Some of those boys, they come back and they don't have nowhere to put their hands. They don't know what to do with the noise in their heads. He looked back at E. Vance's sea chest, which now sat in the place of honor against the cedar wall, its brass fittings polished bright. We're gonna call it Vance's station, Carter said. A Navy station. For the guys who are still trying to find their way back to the pier, Sarah stood up, her hand closing around the logbook. The Navy Yard Historical Society has a fund for veteran-led maritime preservation, she said, a small, real smile breaking through her tired face. I think we can find enough to buy you some white oak and some copper nails, Carter. We'd appreciate that, Carter said. Duke especially. He's the shop foreman, and he's very particular about his biscuits. Sarah laughed, a warm, clean sound that seemed to chase the last of the cold fog out of the room. Outside, the sun was finally breaking through the gray clouds over the Piscataqua, turning the salt grass gold beneath the afternoon light. The tide had reached its height, the water perfectly still, reflecting the blue of the sky like a giant polished glass mirror. Duke walked out onto the dock, his heavy paws clicking rhythmically on the new cedar planks. He sat down at the very edge of the wood, his nose lifted into the wind, his ears rotating toward the distant whistle of the shipyard shift change. He was an old dog. His muzzle was gray, and his hip would always ache when the snow came. But he was on watch, and beside him, Carter Miller stood looking out at the river, his shoulders straight, his hand resting on the dog's head. Finally home.